Last week, we saw how we can create an EC2 instance on AWS. And this week, we are going to keep working with Ansible, but this time we are going to use this EC2 instance that we have created. And we are going to run tasks not on localhost like we've done before, but this time on the EC2 instance itself to provision our application. So here in my case, I already run my playbooks to create my VPC and my instance. And I set up my Ansible dynamic inventory. So if I look at the inventory for my Ansible, I can see that I have a group called AWS EC2. And in this group, I have the EC2 instance that was created by my playbook. So I can check that these targets can be used by Ansible by running the ping module on them. So for any kind of modules, we could do that with localhost. So you can use a host, or you can also use a group. So you can see here that I have a group called local with the @ sign. And if I use the group, it will run the command on all the machines of the group. So I can directly use AWS EC2, and it will run the ping module on all instances of the AWS EC2 group. I only have one, and it does work because it returns one. So that means that we can use these as targets in plays. So we're going to write our playbook, start writing it, and I'm going to call it deploy.yaml. And this is going to be a typical Ansible playbook. So my play is going to apply to the host group AWS EC2, and I'll be able to start writing tasks here. So now we are going to work on the remote instance. So the tasks are going to set up the application for us. So here to deploy our application, one of the first things we have to do is to install software. We want to make sure that all the software that we need is going to be installed and available on the instance. So that includes Nginx, MySQL, everything that Python needs. We also need to create a user, etc., etc. So we are going to do that, but instead of doing through shell scripting, we are going to do it through Ansible. So what's important here is that you look at the steps that you performed when you set up the application manually, and then you look for Ansible modules that help you achieve these goals. One of the first steps, as I said, was installing software, and there is a module for that in Ansible. And I'm going to share my screen here. And you have several ways of achieving that. There is a package called, a module called package in Ansible that allows you to manage your packages on your operating system. We're using Ubuntu, so the package manager is called apt, and we can actually use a module called apt in Ansible, and that will allow us to install software on our instance through Ansible. So here, it's pretty straightforward. There are lots of options, like always. We can have a look at examples. And here, we can see how we can install software. So here, you just provide the name of the package that you want to use to the apt module, and that is going to make it install. You can specify state present to make sure that this package is actually going to be installed. As you can see, the default value for the state is present. So this is something that you can actually omit when writing your playbook. So now let me switch back to my terminal. All right, so the first step here is going to be installing software. So the name of the task will be installing software. And we're going to use the apt module. And let's start with installing Nginx. because we know that we're going to need Nginx on our instance. So this is going to be my first playbook. It has one play. It applies to AWS EC2, which is a group of instances, and it has one task, which is installing Nginx. So I can save this, and now I can run the playbook by running the Ansible playbook command. So Ansible is going to connect to my remote target, and it's going to try to install software, and it's not going to work. And here you can read details, and it tells you that there is a permission denied problem running this command. Are you root? So this is one of the issues that we're going to have with some Ansible modules. Some of the commands you want to run, you actually used to run them using the sudo command, so that you would have administrator access to your instance. If you look at your inventory, and that includes the group variables for your AWS EC2 instances, you will see that you set it up so that you connect with the Ubuntu user. So the Ubuntu user is not the root user, but it has sudo access to obtain administrator privileges on the instance. There is no such thing as sudo in Ansible. The closest thing you have to sudo in Ansible is something called become. So here you can say become true. And what this is going to do is that when connecting to the remote target, the tasks that have become true will be run as the root user. Now, if I run my playbook again, the task actually completes, and now Nginx has been installed on my target. The one nice thing about this is that the apt module is idempotent. So if you run the playbook again, the task will not change anything on the remote target because Nginx is already installed. So you get an OK back. So thanks to this become true, we've been able to run the task as root. What become true does is very similar to sudo. So by default, sudo will make you the root user, but you can also become a different user. So when you use become true, what this actually does is that it makes you change to another user. By default, this is going to be the root user, but you can also use a different user here. For instance, I could change to the user teamg by using the additional parameter become user, and then the name of the user that I want to become. By default, this is root. So I can just use become true, and this is going to make me root for this very command. All right, so now we have a module that installs Nginx, one piece of software. We can actually have a look at the instance and check that we can access it through a web browser. And we should see the default Nginx page. I'm going to share my other window here, this one. So this is my EC2 instance, and that's my default Nginx page. I'm back in my terminal, and now the idea is that I'm going to look for Ansible modules that allow me to do all the things that I wanted to do, that are required for me to set up the application in my playbook. I'm gonna keep working on my tasks. We have created a user during the manual setup to run the backend service. So I'm going to add that user as well. through Ansible. I think this is how it's done using the user module. So here, once again, it's going to be a lot about finding the Ansible module that fits your needs. On my website, in the using Ansible page, you have a list of configuration management modules, which are very useful. So you've got APT, users. So I'm going to look at user because that's the one I'm using right now. But a little bit later in the process, we're going to copy files and set up folders and whatnot. So you are going to use the file module, the copy module. We're going to download the code for the application. So we'll probably use the get URL module, etc., etc. So here to create a user, I'm going to jump straight to the examples. And yes, you can create a user by using user module name, the name of the user. I'm going to run. Oh, sorry. Change my screen sharing. Yeah. I have my playbook with my backend user. I'm going to run this Ansible playbook. And now actually I was expecting that. I will have another issue with my playbook. Once again, we've got permission denied because that Ubuntu user cannot create a user on the system. You need administrative privileges for that. So you'll need to adjust your playbook and make sure that you use become true for this task as well. If you run it again, this is idempotent. So we get OK back. Now we have the task to add the user that just ran. And this module is also idempotent. So if we run the playbook again, instead of getting it changed, we are going to get an OK back this time. All right. What is the next step? I'm not going to go too much in details because that's going to be your job in the lab, but you will have to go through all the required steps. So one of the steps that you will have to complete is to download the code in order to set up the application on the instance. So you are going to get a task for that downloads the code. There is a module in Ansible called get URL, which allows you to download files. So this is good for what we need. Let me share my other screen. It is this module, get URL, so we can have a look at the documentation. Probably have a look at the examples. URL dest. Okay, so you have the application here. And this is the link. Actually goes to my GitHub. So I can copy that link and then use it in my get URL Ansible module. Now back to my terminal. This is the URL of the file that I want to download. And here I'm going to provide the path to the location where I want to save the file that I'm currently downloading. So once again, you have to think about permissions. You are running this task as the Ubuntu user. So you want to write this file into a location where Ubuntu can write. So that includes the home folder of the Ubuntu user. What is also quite convenient is the /tmp location of any POSIX system, which is used to hold temporary files. So in our case here, I'm going to save this zip archive to /tmp/source code.zip, or just source.zip. Okay, so this is a location where I can write as the Ubuntu user, which is the user running this module. So I should be fine running this playbook. Okay, so we have the task that completed. It changed something on the target. Once again, this task is idempotent. So if you try to run the playbook again, what Ansible is going to do is that it's going to look at the checksum of the file and then compare that with the headers of the HTTP request, and then decide to download or not the file again. So now if you run this playbook, you actually have the source code available in /tmp/source.zip. Okay, so that's good. Now we have the zip file. We want to unzip it. So here, once again, you have a module for that. And whoops, this page. The module that you want to use is unarchive, because a zip file is an archive, and Ansible has a module to unarchive compressed files. So once again, you can have a look at the documentation and examples. And this is how it's going to work. You're going to unarchive using the module a file, and you will use a destination to specify where you want to host the file. There is something here called remote src, which is some parameter that happens with other Ansible modules as well. And this remote src, when you set it to, by default, what unarchive is going to do is that it's going to copy the file from your Ansible host to your target and then uncompress it. However, if the file is already on the remote target, then you want to use the parameter remote src yes. So in our case here, we download the zip file on the remote, and then we want to unarchive the file that already is on the remote. So we want to use remote src yes, and we also need to set up a destination for these files. So back to my terminal. Here, I'm going to go and unarchive or unzip. Archive. I'm going to use unarchive, and the source for the unarchive file is going to be source.zip. And then here for the destination, same situation as before. You want to write into some place where you have write permissions. So /tmp is a good idea. And let's say /tmp/code. Okay, we'll save this, and now we'll, obviously this is not going to work because Ansible playbooks are a lot about trial and error. So you are going to try and make things work. You will most likely encounter an error like I just did, and then you're going to try and fix it. So here, well, that was exactly what I was talking about earlier. I forgot to use the remote src option because my zip file is on the target and not on my local computer. I need to use remote src, yes. But this is not the error that I was expecting, but it's a good example. Okay, this is also not the error that I was expecting, but it's a good example too. I have some error message here that tells me that this directory must be an existing directory. So that's an interesting information. I will need to create that directory first. I will try to reproduce the error that you will most likely encounter when running this. Okay, it looks like I need to fix that problem before I can fix the other one. So let's fix this. We have a problem here, /tmp/code must be an existing directory. So we'll create it. Here, what's important is that you don't want to use run shell commands in your Ansible playbook. The concept of Ansible is that you get away from shell scripting so that you don't have all the problems that are related to shell scripting, mostly idempotence. So here you are going to use another Ansible module to create the directory, and this module is called file. It allows you to manage files and properties. So once again, I'm going to drop down to the examples. And here I've got state directories. Okay, so here you can create a directory if it does not exist. You use file and you use the parameter state directory. So this is what we're going to do. We are going to create 10 directory for source code. Nope, like that. Its name, and we're going to use the file module. And the file module is going to work. Oh, I should change my screen. Okay, so my file module is going to work on the /tmp/code path. We want this to be a directory. Okay. Save this. Run the playbook. We have it changed because that directory did not exist before. And this is the error that I was expecting. Now Ansible is telling you that could not process the archive. And apparently we need unzip, which is not installed on our instance. This is something that you are going to fix in your playbook once again. So you'll need unzip in order to unzip zip file. That is not installed. The good thing about the apt package is that you can provide it with a name of packages instead of just one package. So here I'm going to add unzip to the list of packages that I want to install. So I changed my syntax a little bit for my apt module, and I added this unzip and made it into a list because I used dashes. So I can save my playbook and run it again. Now this software task is going to give me a change because unzip was not installed before, and now it is. So that changed something. And now you can see that the unarchive task actually completes. I'm going to run the playbook once more just to make sure that I get all OKs back. Okay, great. So this is good. What else do we have to do? Quite a lot of things. We need to install MySQL. We need to set up the backend files. We need to install the dependencies for Python, etc., etc. So I'm not going to go through all of these steps. You should have a look at the list. Is that the right? At the list of modules that you can find here. So if you want to copy files to the remote, you can use copy, for instance. If you want to restart Nginx because you changed the configuration file, you can use systemd. Maybe I can do that real quick. Copy systemd. Yeah, so here we'll have a little bit of preliminary work to do. Let's say I'm going to set up Nginx through Ansible. So how am I going to do that? I'm going to share my screen in the terminal. And Nginx is installed. We know that, but we want to make a couple changes to it. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to create a directory for front-end files. Nginx is going to serve our front-end files. It's just an HTML file, but I'm going to create a nice directory for that. So we want to use the file module once again, and we are going to use, let's say, /frontend. And that is going to be a directory. Permissions here, /tmp, we had permissions to do whatever we wanted there, but / we don't have permissions to do that. So we'll want to use become true in order to get admin privileges just to create that directory. If we use become true, we are going to be the root user. So that directory is going to be created with the root owner, which is going to prevent us from writing into that directory later. So in this case, what I'm going to do here is going to use Ubuntu as my owner so that my playbook can keep on working with these files. Let's try that out. Okay, so my directory has been created. I happen to have an SSH connection to my instance on this next tab. So I should be able to go to /frontend now. And you see that this /frontend directory is owned by Ubuntu as specified in my playbook. So now it means that any task that will attempt to write into frontend should work with the Ubuntu user. So now a little something that is always nice with Ansible is that this Ubuntu user is actually related to the fact that you are running your playbooks through SSH and that you are using this Ubuntu user here. So if you want to make your playbook really nice and customizable, you should actually think about the fact that this could be changed to something else should you use a different template. So it would be a good idea to actually tell Ansible that you want to use this as the name of the user that will own the directory you're creating. And this actually happens to be a variable. So last week, we registered variables from our tasks so that we can reuse them in other tasks. But there are variables that are already defined in your playbooks, and this is one of them, Ansible SSH user. You can see them all if you run --vars when running the Ansible inventory command. So here my, well, that's a lot of variables, but my EC2 instance has a couple of variables. You can see Ansible SSH user is going to be Ubuntu. That's the architecture. So then you can actually do conditionals based on the way your virtual machines are running. You get the instance type as well, which is always interesting. The public IP address, which is also good to know, the private IP address and whatnot. So if you want to make that very nice, you would go here, and then you would use here the Ansible SSH user variable, which happens to be Ubuntu in our setup. Oh, no, that's not what I wanted to run. Now, if I want to run the playbook again, nothing should change because this Ansible SSH user variable has the same value as Ubuntu, which is what we used to run the playbook before. Okay, so now this directory belongs to the Ubuntu user. And that means that I can copy my index.html into that folder. And then I'm going to make sure that Nginx serves files from that folder. I'm going to switch to my SSH connection here. And if I go to /tmp, I have my code folder that I can inspect. And the first thing that you see is that this code folder actually has a folder in it. And then you have the front end. And this is where you got the index.html. So if you look at the path to the index.html, it's this whole path over here. All right, so you want to copy this index.html and put that into the /frontend folder. So we can use the copy module for that. We can look at the examples. Okay, so this is how you're going to copy files to your remote target. Now, the problem with this is that, once again, copy is usually used to copy files from your Ansible host to your remote target. In our case, the file that we want to copy is already on the remote target. So in this case, we are going to use remote src because we don't want to copy from our workstation to the target. The source file is already on the remote. So now if I go back here, I can use setup front-end files. I'm going to use the copy module. The source is going to be not this. This is the wrong copy and paste. The source is going to be this path, which comes from the unzipping of the archive. And the destination is going to be /frontend, and let's say index.html. You could also copy the whole folder. That you can have a look at the options to make that work. And I'm going to use remote src. So because I've done /frontend, that is owned by my SSH user, which is going to run this task, this is going to complete, and I'm going to be able to move that file into its intended destination. And I don't need to use become true anymore here, because I do have permissions in the /frontend folder. Okay, so now I should have my files copied into /frontend. I can check that by doing cd/frontend, and I can look at my directory, and I do have an index.html here. So now the next step is going to make sure that Nginx is serving the files from this location. So as you know, this happens through the default configuration file, and we would need to change the root parameter here. And so this is a file that is on the target, and I want to change it. So you don't want to use, oh, sorry, I was not sharing the right screen here. So this is my Nginx configuration file. I have my HTML file in /frontend, and I want to make Nginx serve my front-end files from the root folder, which is going to be /frontend. So as I said, you need to change the contents of the file, or what you could also do is copy this file to your local workstation, make the changes you need, and then use Ansible to copy it back to your instance. So this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to exit from here. I'm going to use SCP, and I'm going to SCP my default file locally to my file that I will call Nginx default. Okay, so now this is my Nginx. This is my Nginx default. I'm just going to clean it up so that it's easier to read on the screen. Just basically removing all the commands. Okay, so this is a very compact nginx.conf, and here I'm locally on my workstation. I made changes to that file, so I'm going to change this to /frontend. I'm going to save the changes. So now this file is locally on my computer. I can look at my playbook, and then I can actually copy that file back to my instance. So this time I'm going to use copy again, but I'm not going to use remote src yes. The reason for that is because this file, Nginx default, is not on the remote. It's on my local computer. So I want to copy it locally from my computer to this location. So I'm going to run the playbook again. It's the other terminal. And as you were probably expecting, this task fails because I'm trying to copy a file into /etc/nginx/sites available, but my Ubuntu user does not have permissions to write into that location. So here what I need to do is once again use become true. So this is where become true, sometimes you use it, sometimes you don't. It depends on whether you would have used sudo when doing the operation manually. Okay. Okay, nice. We've copied Nginx back to our instance. Let's have a look at that. Yes, we can see that this file was actually changed. Now it contains the same stuff at what was on my local workstation. Now the next step is obviously because we made changes to Nginx, we need to restart it to make sure that the changes that we've made in the configuration file are taken into account. So once again, for this, you have a systemd module that allows you to deal with systemctl commands. Everything you do with systemctl, you can do it with systemd. So I'm going to share here. And this systemd, you can find it as always on the Ansible documentation website. And here, basically you use the name of the service and the state that you want to use. So in our case, we are going to make it restarted because we want to restart it. So the name is Nginx, and the state is going to be restarted. Sorry. Here, my systemd module, Nginx, restarted. You should now get used to that. Systemd uses systemctl commands. Systemctl commands require sudo, so you want to use become true here in order to make that happen. Okay, save this, run the playbook. Many of these tasks are idempotent. However, sometimes your Ansible tasks are not going to be idempotent. Restart Nginx, for instance, is not idempotent. Every time you run the playbook, you are going to restart Nginx because that's a hard imperative command. You want to restart Nginx. So every time you're going to run the playbook, Nginx is going to restart. This is because Ansible is not idempotent by itself. It's the way you use it that makes it idempotent. The good thing about Ansible is that it's quite easy to make it idempotent without a lot of effort. So here I'm running my playbook again, and even though I already run it before, my restart Nginx tasks will always get a change back to me because it's not idempotent by definition. So if everything went well, I should be able to look at my instance in a web browser, and I should at least see an HTML file. Okay, so I do see an HTML file, and I can, am I sharing that? And here in the console, I get some errors, obviously because /JSON doesn't work at the moment, because I have still a lot of work to do to set up my instance. So that's what you're going to do. You're going to go back to your list of tasks that you've done manually, and you're going to translate them into Ansible tasks. So I've done a little bit of it. A lot of the work will be regarding the backend and the database setup, same as what I've done with the unzip dependency. When you're going to install dependencies in Python, you will need some additional modules on your system. So once again, if you've set it up manually, you should have a list of all the things you went through, and you just have to replicate them in Ansible. There are some Ansible modules that you can use to set up the user and the database. And that happens with the MySQL user and MySQL DB modules. So you can use them, and you should probably use them, but they will require, so you can read the notes here, they will require some additional setup on your remote target. So make sure that you get this working first before you can use MySQL user. Once you've got it working, then it's really, really efficient, because you can just provide the name of the user that you want to create, and it's going to make it happen. Another one is MySQL DB, which is the same, but for a database. It allows you to easily manage in an idempotent way a database in your MySQL setup. So you can just use MySQL DB, and this is going to create these databases, so you can use them later on in the application. Something that you'll need as well is pip, that will allow you to install pip dependencies. So this is where you'll need to be careful about using become. You don't want to install the dependencies as root. You want to install them as the backend user. So this is where you're going to use become user in your tasks. So side note about this, let me share my screen back to my terminal. I've done it here. I created a backend user. So I could run tasks as the backend user. So for instance, I'm going to create a file as backend user. So here, this is where I would use become true and become user backend. So that is going to let me run this task as the backend user and not as root or not as the Ubuntu user anymore. And I'm going to create /tmp/example. I'm going to touch this file as the backend user. So this is something that you'll have to do in your application setup. You're going to run some tasks as the backend user because you want to install Python dependencies as this user, and the source application source code is going to be owned by this user as well. The service that you are going to set up is also going to be running as this backend user. So you will need to use it quite often. So this is going to, as an example, just create a file as this backend user. And if you try to run this playbook, very likely you will have a weird looking error, which I'm hoping is going to happen soon. Yes. So we have this problem. The reason for this is because Ansible is using advanced ACL features on the file system when it's using become user and you change to a different user. So in order to fix that problem, you will want to install an additional piece of software, which is called ACL. It's not really related to our application, but it's something that we will need in order for Ansible to be able to switch users. So make sure that you install that in your APT module. Now, if I run it again, obviously the install software step is going to be changed instead of OK, because I have a new piece of software to install. But most of the other tasks are going to be OK. All right, so this is what happened. And now if I look at my /tmp folder on my instance, you can see that this file actually belongs to my backend user. So this is something you're going to use a lot when setting up the backend part of your application. All your Python source code files will belong to the owner backend, or whatever name you choose for your backend user. And your application is also going to run as this backend user. You should also have a look at the user module, because you may want to specify the home folder of the backend user to /backend, so you don't have to create any kind of directories yourselves. This is all on you. You can choose whatever you want as long as it works. So you can use /home /backend, whatever you want, but just stick to a naming scheme for your directories and then reuse them consistently throughout your playbooks. Think about the permissions as well. If you're creating /backend, you will need to make sure that this directory belongs to the backend user before you can use it as this user. And the last, the last word of advice when working with playbooks, and it's the same as when you're working with shell scripts, you want to make sure that you're using full path as much as possible. So here, I'm not going to use paths that don't start with a /, because if I use a /, I know that this is going to be an absolute path on my file system. So wherever I am, whichever location I'm in when I'm running the playbook, how my Ubuntu user is set up on my remote, etc., this path will always refer to this absolute path that I just wrote down. So this is a good idea to prevent issues in your playbook. So make sure that you pay attention to your path, and also make sure that you pay attention to the output of your Ansible playbooks. When you're developing your playbooks, it could be a good idea to have an SSH session on your instance next to your playbook terminal, so that you can actually check what your modules have done on your remote, and if that is the actual intended way you wanted it to work. So for next week, you will have to work on that, set up a playbook for the web application, so that by the end of class, you should have a playbook that allows you to completely set up the application from scratch. And next week, we will combine the playbooks we've done with AWS infrastructure with these application setups, so that we can have a full automated deployment from scratch.